Recording started. Share my screen. Okay, so you should see browser, terminal, IntelliJ, hopefully. Okay, so let's start. Yeah, hello everyone. Yeah, that's the Let's Chat About session about local development with Tilt. Just a little bit of context. So we have a discussion here with the current and previous sessions. So if you want to get updates, you can just subscribe to the discussion and follow along there. If you have any feedback or ideas for further topics, just feel free to comment in this discussion. But now let's get started with the current topic. And by the way, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to ask. And yeah. Okay, good. I just read the chat. I hope you can all hear me. Good. Yeah, feel free to just interrupt, or if it might be hard, just raise your hand. I'll try to see it on my second screen. Okay, good. So just sorting some stuff. Okay, good. So what is Tilt or Tilt dev environment? So the idea is that when we develop Cluster API, we can run essentially a local management cluster with all our controllers and also with infra providers if they are compliant. They need a little bit of configuration. And then, yeah, you have your local development cluster, your local management cluster. You can run your current code. You can modify your code. You can debug it. You can take a look at logs, run end-to-end tests against that cluster if you want, and just, yeah, develop, play with the code, figure out how everything works. That's the rough idea why we have it and for what we're using it. It comes very close to what happens if you create a bootstrap cluster and then run cluster cuddle init to deploy providers. The difference is only that it uses your current local code essentially. But apart from that, it essentially simulates cluster cuddle init partially. High-level features, just to give some high-level overview. So yeah, of course, you deploy and can redeploy your local code changes. You can debug providers by just connecting with a Go debugger. We have Grafana deployed there, so you can take a look at metrics and logs, all that stuff. Yeah, I think that's roughly it. For my personal take when I'm using it, so usually when I'm developing, I'm, of course, if possible, just using unit tests or so, but it becomes more relevant if you want to see how everything works end to end, how multiple controllers work with each other and stuff like that. So for me, it wouldn't really replace something like, using unit tests for development and stuff like that. Yeah, and finally, I would say it's our equivalent to prod. So a lot of folks are mainly working on upstream cluster API, so we don't really running all that stuff in production or with a logging stack and all that stuff. So essentially, that's our feedback loop to hopefully use cluster API similar to users are using it, and to improve it accordingly if the logs are not that great or if metrics are missing, etc., etc. So okay, but now concrete. Yeah. So first of all, I'll start with how to set it all up. So we have this documentation here in our book, and I'm intentionally on the main page of our book because I cleaned it up a little bit recently. So what you need to run it is Docker, of course, to run Docker images, obviously then kind, because Tilt is only deploying onto a Kubernetes cluster, and we're using kind to actually create that cluster or management cluster. Yeah, Tilt is obvious. Then we're using customize and end subs. We need them because as we are simulating cluster cuddle init, essentially, we have to render all our YAML files. So we're able to deploy the providers and stuff. And end subs is for replacing the variables we have in our YAMLs. Then you don't need it for all, but we're using Helm to deploy Grafana, Bromtail, Loki, stuff like that. So we have an option to deploy some observability tools. And if you want to use that, you also need Helm in your path. Yeah, and apart from that, clone the cluster API repository, clone all the providers you want to deploy, and that's it. Then the first thing you do is you create a Kubernetes cluster. We're only actually using it with kind. I assume you can use any Kubernetes cluster, but yeah, for us, it's just the easiest way to set it up. We have one shell script here in our repository to make it easier. So in theory, you can just run kind create cluster. But if you want to use capd, then you have to create it with certain flags, because capd requires some additional volume mounts. So I'm usually just creating the kind cluster with that script so that capd works. Oh yeah, Shivani.
Actually, my question is regarding the customize. So I've tried this make customize, but it says like no rule is defined for the customize option. So where do we need to run it exactly, from the root or somewhere else?
Good point. Hey, nice finding. I'll note that for later.
Okay, yeah.
That was actually a good question. So
I've tried it from the root, but it's not showing any.
Yep. What I'm wondering is if we are running it, if it isn't there. Probably not.
Actually, the issue is like if your customize is old, then with the latest support of this Helm, we are not able to make our tilt up. So we need to upgrade it, and to upgrade, so without this, we have to do it manually.
Yeah. Yep. That should be how it works. What I can tell you, I think we can figure that out. So I'm not sure where the target is, but essentially, as part of our tilt up, we're using Go binary. That Go binary is using customize from that folder. So what I probably did incorrectly, I would assume that we at least have that hack tools bin customize target, which should build it.
Yeah, if it is latest, then it works fine, but if it's old, then it fails the tilt up.
Okay, that's pretty weird. I would have assumed that that's a target, but I get your point that it doesn't work. Let's see if we have hack tools customize or if we have some kind of auto completion. Okay, to be honest, I don't know, but I'll follow up and figure it out. Apparently, I did run it in the past, so it just works. Maybe we can't.
Weirdly, it works for me on the latest main. I don't know why.
With Cappy?
Yeah, on the Cappy root.
Okay, just make customize.
Just make customize.
Jen, is it possible that you have like some other installation of customize elsewhere in your system?
Here also, I think it's not working. Like with Stephen also, I tried today also. It's not working for me with the latest.
My versions should be pretty up to date from Cluster API.
Maybe we can take this later if.
Yeah, no problem. I'll, as I said, I follow up and figure out what the problem here is. But it doesn't really help if you have customized somewhere in your path, because we're using that path hard coded. So it shouldn't pick up some random customize. It should actually only pick up that one. Slightly confused why the target doesn't work. That's one try. I mean, not that expert regarding make files, but it looks pretty straightforward here. Just checking if we have similar thing. Yeah, I mean, even the auto completion works. That's. Oh, sorry, I misinterpreted my log output. So that isn't actually saying the target doesn't exist. It just tells me that there's nothing to do. So if it doesn't work for you because you have an old customized version, you have to run make clean bin and then make customize. And then you're getting the target is not defined, or is it then reinstalling customize?
Actually, it was not working, so I installed it with Brew, and then it worked fine for me.
Okay, at least I tried with clean bin, and then it worked.
Okay. Perfect. And let's assume that works, and please tell me if there are further problems. Yeah, but what we currently definitely don't have is we're not verifying that we have the right customized version, and just running the target. I think with customize current state of main, we're not actually updating the binary. So there's a PR out, which I think either that PR or with follow-up should fix that situation. But currently we're just installing customize, and if it's there, then it's there. We're not checking the version, but that shell script will be gone. So yeah, but what we could definitely implement if someone wants to follow up or open an issue or something. We have that binary here, which uses customize, and it could check if customize has the right version before actually using it, and then just print out an error. Hey, please run make clean bin, etc. To fix up your customized version. Okay, so where was I? Hack. Let's see if I actually started that script. Yeah, okay, I did. Yeah, so now we have a local kind cluster, and it should be pretty much empty. Yeah, let's just see. Okay, then we need a tilt settings file. Since a recent PR, you can either write it in YAML or JSON. YAML might be easier because you can just comment out stuff. A little bit less hacky to do. For now, I only show the basic settings. So I didn't really try it again, but I think the minimal config you need is if you want to deploy some additional providers, which are outside of the core repository, you need provider repositories, and you have to enable providers. So I guess strictly the absolutely minimal config should be that. And as far as I'm aware, everything else should be optional. I go over that file later on, just to explain what you can do. Okay, but now let's actually run till up.
I have one question, Stefan.
Yeah.
So initially there was no constraint on using the cluster name, but I think now we have started using CAPI test, and otherwise the tilt up won't work. So any specific reason for the same?
So the reason is that we have the tag shell script. So kind cluster, what was the name? Install. Here. And that what we didn't want to do is we just with that shell script we didn't want to use the default name in kind. We just want to make it CAPI specific to not, I don't know, run into issues with another cluster which might be there. So what we currently have is when you just run that script, then you have CAPI test, and when you just run tilt up, then it's also using CAPI test. But you can override that environment variable with the name you want, and then both should work.
Okay. Yeah.
But essentially, we just wanted to namespace our usage of the local kind cluster. That was the reason.
Sure, makes sense.
Okay, so yeah, just a quick overview or tilt. I'm not sure who already used it or not. Just had to look at the notes so I don't miss anything important. So that page is essentially an overview what tilt just deployed. Yeah, let's just go over it. So first of all, we were building a bunch of binaries. So in my case, I'm just using the core controllers plus capd. So those are the binary builds. Then the corresponding deployments for all those controllers. And then we just labeled all that stuff that you can just, yeah, drill into it however you want. But yeah, then that's the same stuff again, just grouped by the provider. So capg, capd, capbk, what's the name? Capd, cabby, KCP. Then we have some observability tools, as already mentioned. So we're currently deploying Promtail to ship logs, Loki to store logs, Grafana to look at logs and metrics at the moment, and Prometheus to scrape and store metrics. I'm not super sure about that, but I think everything else which is not in one of those categories is automatically uncategorized in tilt. And we have one additional thing, which are provider CRDs. So to make the local management cluster as realistic as possible, we are also deploying provider CRDs. So usually if you would just deploy our local YAML files, you wouldn't get the provider CRDs, which because they're usually just created by cluster cuddle. But yeah, we also implemented in tilt. There are some things where you actually need those. So for example, if you want to run an end-to-end test against that local management cluster, then you will need those provider CRDs. One caveat, they're just deployed with some random development version. Usually that's not a problem, but yeah, just to mention it. Yeah, and then finally you have the tilt file here, which is just, I would say the top level thing here. Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, tilt just runs through tilt file, generates all those resources. And here they are. If something in the tilt file changes, then it just recalculates everything, redeploys everything. So for example, you can enable or disable Prometheus, and then it's redeployed or undeployed. Depending on your config, you can change your source code of a controller, and it's either automatically redeployed or you can click on a button. That's up to you. Yeah. Any questions? Otherwise, just continue. Okay.
Stefan, I didn't get this provider CRD part. Like, is this a different CRD? Like, what is this about?
So Cluster Cattle has a dedicated CRD which represents deployed providers. That's essentially what it is. And they are not defined anywhere in our YAML files. They are just when you use Cluster Cattle init or upgrade, etc. Then it manages to, let's say, it represents the currently deployed providers by keeping those CRDs up to date. I can show you one of them. Just as an example. So yeah, provider itself is CRD. In that case, that one represents the, where's the name? Cluster API itself, the core controller. And yeah, provider name, then the type, it's a core provider, and the version. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, kind of. Maybe I need to look into that.
Yeah, it's probably
like
more around what that actually is,
yeah,
and how classical uses it. That's it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
But from a tilt perspective, we're just also deploying it so that everything works as you would expect with a regular cluster created via cluster cattle.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, Stefan. One query, like this grouping of providers, it is done automatically, or we have to do something in tilt settings?
That is done automatically.
Okay.
Yeah, that's some magic in our tilt file where we set. So those are built-in providers. They just have a hard-coded definition there. But as far as I'm aware, for external providers, which are not in the core repository and not hard-coded here, it's just calculated based on the provider name or something, as far as I know.
Okay. And another very basic question. So this tool that is called Tilt, it is very specific to like Kubernetes ecosystem, or does it have other use cases as well?
It's a very good question. I'm not 100% sure. So I assume not. I only saw it really used with Kubernetes clusters because then Tilt was used to deploy stuff on top of Kubernetes. But it could be that you can also deploy to other targets. But I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
But I would assume that the main use case or the widest usage is probably when it's used with Kubernetes, as far as I know.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, okay. Yeah. So then when you click at all resources, then you just see your individual providers. You can take a look at logs. One example, here you can see how the binary is built and if there are errors. I mean, sometimes there are compile errors and stuff, but apart from that, that's pretty much not spectacular in any way. And when you look at a specific controller, then you see how it built the Docker image of the controller. And later on, I think somewhere here, it deployed the provider. So in that case, the service and the deployment itself and the provider resource. And then was tracking the rollout. And as soon as the pod comes up, it's tailing the logs of that controller. So that's what we can see here. If your controller crashes or something, then it will automatically attach the tail to the new container. If you redeploy by clicking here, for example, that was a manually triggered redeployment, and it just builds again, deploys again, tails again. Pretty straightforward. Some additional stuff here on that UI. So as I mentioned before, we are deploying Grafana, Prometheus, and Loki. And we are also configuring local port forwards. So those things are obviously running in Kubernetes, but they have port forward to your local machine. So you can just access them here. And I would say the most useful things right now is if you want to look at some metrics, I don't know, controllers, whatever. Or probably even more useful if you want to look at logs. Yeah, you can just use it immediately and try to figure out what's going on. I'll go in a little bit more detail later on what you can do here. But for us, it's currently very useful because we're trying to improve the logs. So we have an entire environment here essentially to evaluate what good logs could be, how we can use them, how we can actually figure out what's going on by just looking at the logs. And yeah, Shivani.
So how can we add any custom metrics here? Like, because these are only specific to like the CRDs or the controllers that we are running. Suppose if any provider we configure the same thing, then can we track the API level matrices?
So you don't really have to do anything in Tilt. So what is happening in Tilt is only that we deploy Prometheus and configure it to pull the metrics from your controller. But the question is, how can you add the metrics in your controller? So essentially, you have to make sure that you expose the metrics in your controller. I'm not sure how that's currently implemented, but there should be something like a metric registry. And then you can register your new metric there.
Okay. So
Probably
for customs, for custom metrics, we have to make a change in the code and add it manually. So this basically, the default ones are like pushed using the queue builder, or we have done something in our code?
The default ones that should be already there should be, let's say, automatically registered by controller runtime.
Okay, so it's a controller runtime library that is pushing.
Yeah, by using a bunch of other libraries, but yeah, controller runtime is the one that provides them. So let's take a look at what we do in our code. Just a quick one, but so there should be something like a metric endpoint config here somewhere. A metric bind address. Yep. So the only thing that we have is we configure somewhere here our metrics bind address with a default value. And then we hand it over to controller runtime. And controller runtime internally registers a bunch of metrics, like those controller underscore metrics, for example, that you see here. And they are already there. And yeah, the question is how to add more. I don't know how it's currently implemented because as far as I know, we don't have additional custom metrics in core CAPI right now, which is not super great, but the current state. I don't know how it is in providers.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. Okay, the controller runtime is pushing the default one.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks.
I think if you remember me or if I don't forget, when we later take debug into the code, I can quickly show how controller runtime counts those metrics and registers them. Okay, so that was the rough overview. Yeah, now what I would do is essentially create a cluster and yeah, just show how we can use that stuff to develop, figure out how things work, stuff like that. Yeah, so what I'm just doing is I generate a local cluster API, YAML based on capd, so just any version, in that case capd, because yeah, just easier for me. But no worries, I mean, obviously it just also works for other providers. I personally only tried it with AWS, but I don't see any problems there, just using any provider. It's just probably a little bit slower because it's really infrastructure, apart from that. Okay, so let's open a watch here to see. I'll make machines too. Is it all big enough? Yep. Okay. Good. Yeah. So just what you would expect. Machines are provisioning and scaling up and all that stuff. Yeah, and let's take a look at Loki. So I have to say, what I currently have here is not yet on main. So I mean, from a tilt perspective, almost everything is there. But we already made some small adjustments to our logging, which we'll try to bring upstream next, I don't know, 1 or 2 weeks. But the logs are already a little bit improved. Because we're just currently working on that to make it better. But I assume that moving forward, that's something that folks can just use. Okay, so I deployed that stuff. We can use the log browser. So I don't really want to go too much into Grafana or Loki details, but just the very the easiest stuff that you can do. You can filter on different labels. So every log line gets a bunch of labels. Those are added by Promtail. For those who are interested. So when Promtail retrieves the logs and pushes them into Loki, it adds metadata like from which pod are those logs and which namespace is that pod. And some additional metadata on which node is it running. We have an additional config there. So in log lines where we also have the data for which cluster and for which machine that namespace the current log line is. We also have labels there. So let's see. So first thing, I just filter on a controller. So if I do that, I just see the logs for that controller. One very useful thing to do is probably first filter on some stuff, and then you can click here on that button, and then it just shows you only the message. So in that case, you just see only the messages, and all the other noises is gone. And then you can add more information if you want to. So for example, that wasn't really a good logline to show, but let's see. Okay, yeah, there should be one more label that currently isn't there. That's bad. Okay, yeah. There should be a controller label so that you can see to which controller it relates. But, yeah, I know why it's not there. So because that is JSON logging, Loki will automatically has some labels, and those are the ones from Promtail. But if you want to filter on any of those labels here, which are not already pre-configured bars, you have to do pipe JSON. And after you did that, then you will have a bunch more. And now, actually, there should be a control label. Yeah, but it's still not there. Oh, yeah, okay. So not every log line is coming from a controller. Yeah, so now I got a log line from a controller, so I can also just say, hey, first of all, let's print the controller and the message. So then you can see, oh, that controller is emitting that message. Of course, you can also filter if you just want to know what the machine controller is doing, stuff like that. So that's more or less the way to drill into a specific controller manager and then into a controller. What might be even more useful is if you want to know what is happening related to a specific cluster, then you can just filter on the cluster, and then you see every log line related to that cluster. Yeah, we have similar stuff. I don't show all of them, but let's see. So yeah, you can also look at API server logs if you want to, or containers probably not that useful. So all our containers are called manager. So that's just all of them. But yeah, here we have the controllers. Machine is probably useful if you want to just see log lines of a specific machine. You can just select that one, or in a specific namespace, etc., etc. Any questions? As I said, I don't want to go into too much detail, but just show how it can be useful. Okay. Good. Then I would make one example how you can actually change code. And oh yeah, I slightly screwed up the order. So what I actually want to do is I want to show what you can configure in the tilt settings file, so then it makes sense how to actually debug into stuff. So let's just do a quick overview what you can configure, and feel free to ask if you want to know more. There is something like allowed context. You can use that to make sure that you're not actually deploying to prod or something. So an issue I had from time to time is you're working with kubectl, you have just some random current context, and then you start up tilt, and then you deploy all that nice stuff into some production cluster. I think tilt has some automatic handling. So even if you don't set it, it automatically enables deployments to kind clusters. There is some built-in handling there to detect that. But if you want to deploy it to some other cluster, you have to allow listed here because otherwise tilt will fail on startup. Then there's a trigger mode. So I'm using manual. I'm not sure what the other value is, but essentially there's something like automatic. And if you use automatic, then tilt will automatically rebuild binaries and redeploy a controller if it detects changes to the source files. So yeah, I don't really want that because I like to play around with stuff and don't want to have immediate redeployments when I'm working on something. So I'm just using manual. And when you're using manual, then as I showed before, you can just click on that button here to redeploy. Or when you look in the controller, those buttons. I still don't have figured it out, but I think you actually really have to first build a binary and then rebuild that. But you can try immediately building that. But I think I had some problems, if I remember correctly, that the binary then wasn't up to date. Okay, then registry, I'm just using an empty one. If I remember correctly, so with our shell script, we are automatically deploying, so with that shell script, we're automatically deploying a Docker registry. And as far as I'm aware, tilt automatically discovers that. So when tilt builds and deploys an image, it loads it into that registry, and then it's used from there. You can also push to, I don't know, Google Container Registry or somewhere else if you want to. If you just want to work locally, I think there's no real reason to use an external registry. Yep. Then, as mentioned before, if you have some additional providers you want to deploy, which are not in core, you have to add them here. And yeah, just shortly mentioned that before. So if you want to use tilt with other providers, you have to check them out at, I mean, you can probably check them out somewhere else, but I think it makes sense to just clone them right next to each other. And then you can just reference to them like that. But of course, otherwise you have to just change the path here. So that part is, as far as I know, about how we, in the tilt file, how we discover other providers. So if you want to enable another provider to be used with our tilt environment, you have to add a file to your repository. Let's say in the providers like AWS or Azure, they are of course already there. But if you have your custom provider or something, those providers have that tilt provider JSON, and that's consumed by our tilt file. And what is defined here is what is the name of the provider, then the image name, and that's important. So those are all the files and packages that are watched by tilt, and when something there changes, then it will trigger a rollout if you use trigger mode automatic. So that's just a configuration for that, and that of course can be different in each provider depending on what code it has. Yeah. Oh, and here is actually the label, by the way. So I'm not sure what the default behavior is if you don't specify the label here, but that's where it's taken from. Yeah, and that's the managed name. So it should be relatively simple to add that. Yep. So that part should be about how the tilt file just looks through folders and finds those JSON files. And that part, as far as I know, is then about using that and actually deploying it. So based on that, we will generate those tilt resources here and deploy them. Probably sounds a little bit strange or complicated, but essentially it's very easy to configure. And if you want to know how it actually works, you have to read through our tilt file. Yeah, and of course it's also documented here. So we have a bunch of documentation. Please let us know if something's not clear, but should be all there. One interesting thing is if you want to deploy, for example, AWS, we have some provider-specific documentation here somewhere. So in some cases, provider needs additional, usually credentials as far as I know, but maybe also other configuration. So if you want to use AWS and if you want to actually deploy something, then you have to add your credentials here. I think you can either add them here. I'm not sure, but I think it also works if you just export them in your environment before you run tilt up. If you don't want to put it in that file here, you can try that. I think it works. Yeah. Okay, then we have the kind cluster name. To be honest, I looked at that yesterday and I'm not sure if we still need it or if it's actually used. So you can just try leaving it out or setting it and play around. Could be that we have some legacy properties here. Then customized substitutions. So let's see how that works. Or when, I mean, first of all, of course, if you want to provide credentials, then you need it. But another use case is if you if you want to pass in some configuration in all our customized stuff. So just to explain that. When you are running the regular quick start, then we have something like, hey, you might want to enable feature gates here, or you have to set all those variables before you actually run cluster cuttle in it. And here it works similarly. So first you set whatever you want to export. And then we're using that for customize. So in case of feature gates, either exporting the environment variable or setting it at customize substitutions makes it available. And then when you render that stuff, in that case, it controls if those feature gates are on or off. And as they are off per default, you have to set that stuff to actually enable them. So I just enable all of them, or yeah, I think I missed ignition, but I'm not using ignition. So but yeah, I'm actually just enabling all that I'm regularly using. So I think there's no real downside to it. Okay, next up, we have property for cert manager. So as part of our regular cluster cuttle init, we also deploy cert manager, and that's just a corresponding flag here. I think usually you should set it to true, and as far as I know, it should be true per default. And just to show it, you can look up stuff like that by just grabbing for it in our tilt file. And here you see that the default value is true. Yeah, only makes sense to set it to false if for some reason you want to deploy your own cert manager. Then there's a flag to preload images for kind. Same as for the kind cluster name. I'm not sure how that is used. Maybe it's something in tilt itself. I couldn't really find it yesterday, so maybe that's also not really doing anything. Okay, then, by the way, if there are any questions, I can pause a bit. It's fine. Otherwise, I just go for it. Okay. Yep, so next up, if you want to customize, if you want to deploy your controllers with additional flags, you can just set them here. So in my case, so we merged support for JSON log format 1 or 2 weeks ago, but we didn't enable it per default. But as I want to have JSON logs, because then in Loki everything becomes easier, I'm just using logging format JSON. And similarly, I'm using -v2. I think 0 is default currently. And yeah, that was some other POC of tracing, but yeah. Then deploy observability. So we have a bunch of things that you can deploy on top, which I already mentioned, I guess, 2 or 3 times or so. The possible values are documented here. Essentially, you can just configure whatever you want. If you comment out a line, it's automatically undeployed by tilt. And that's all it is. Yeah, that's not actually working on main right now, just a POC. And last but not least, we have a bunch of debug settings. So if you want to debug your controllers, you can configure some stuff. And those are all, so those port properties are all port forwards. So tilt will create port forwards from that port to whatever it is in your controller. So that port is the port for Delph debugging. Provided port is for the regular Go profiling endpoint, and metrics is just a metrics endpoint. So for me, the most useful thing is actually that port, because yeah, I mean, the metrics, I can also look at them in Prometheus, and I'm not really using profiling at the moment. Continue true false, that's a detail of Go debugging. So you can start controllers with Delph, and you can decide if the controller should wait for debugger to be connected, or if it should immediately continue and just start. And I'm usually using continue true, so that the controller just starts and doesn't have to wait for me. A huge advantage for me is I can just keep that configuration here. I just use tilt up, all controllers are running, and I can just connect the debugger to the running controller at any point in time if I want to, but I don't have to. It just also works without actually doing anything. So I would recommend something like that if you want to use debugging. Okay, so that's that part. What I would show now is how you can actually debug something here. So I think so I deployed the cluster before, and those controls are all running. When we look at the debug ports, which we can do either here, that's pretty hard to look at. So when you look at the currently, Ashutosh.
I had one question on this debug part. So you're saying that when we start our controller, if we have this configuration settings on, we could actually put a breakpoint anytime on the controller code?
Yep. You have to connect the debugger, but then you can set breakpoints and just debug.
But so I have been facing this problem. So what happens if you have multiple Go routines that spawns up somewhere in your code? How do you switch and all? Does that work?
Yeah, it's a limitation.
I'm trying to, I'm trying to find how I can actually make use of it. I've not done it and failed it. I tried to do it, but it didn't work for me. Sometime back.
Yeah, so it's one problem you definitely have is that when you have a breakpoint, which is currently, in break, I don't know what the name is, then it just stops the entire Go runtime and all Go routines. But that's a limitation of Go itself, and there's an issue in GitHub Go, and that can't really be improved. For me, it wasn't really that much of an issue because I know it's there, and in most cases you can work around it, I would say.
Sure.
But let me show you, maybe there's a chance to show why it's not really an issue for me. I mean, what would be an issue if you want to essentially pause at some point and if you really need every other Go routine to work at the same time while you're just waiting? Yeah, you won't get that to work. But if it's fine for you that you just essentially continue when you debug, then you shouldn't use step by step. You can just use continue and other breakpoints. And in between of those steps, other Go routines will just continue to run. Hope it makes sense.
Yeah.
But it can definitely lead to issues. If you set the breakpoint at the wrong place, then everything just stops and you run to issues.
Yes. Yeah. I think I did this. Yeah. Sure. I'll try that once again. See.
And let me know if you have specific issues, and maybe I can give some tips on how to work around that specific situation. But just to explain a little bit more how those flags actually work and what is actually running in our containers. So those debug configurations will lead to this command in, I think I used the Cappy controller here. So what we're actually doing is we're using that start.sh. I'm not sure what that shell script is, but you should be able to grab for it. But then we're running dev. Dev listens on port 30,000. That's just some dev stuff to use the right dev. Dev is a server to REST API version and run headless and stuff. Important thing is continue. So for us, essentially based on our configuration, we have that port, which is also port forwarded to the same port on your machine. And we have continue. Those configurations are passed through essentially. And I also have a provider address, but I'm not using it. Okay, so that's what's running there. And when you look at the controller here, let's see how to get there. It's just running right now, but I want to step into it. So of course I have to know which ports I have actually configured. Just have to move this Zoom thing here. And I'm using IntelliJ, but it should work similarly with VS Code. And we documented it for VS Code and IntelliJ on that tilt page, just by the way. So in IntelliJ, you just say you have a Go remote configuration, and actually the only thing you really have to configure is port 30,000 here. So I just have all those things pre-configured, and I just click on, hey, let's debug core, and that's it. So that is connecting to debugger. And now let's make an example. So I just take a look at the machine deployment controller. So, and for me, it's usually good if you want to understand what's going on in a controller to debug an issue, or just actually understand how it works. I added a breakpoint to the machine deployment controller, and let's make a change to actually trigger reconcile. So I think I should have something in my history, and yeah, let's scale it up to 3. And now we're immediately inside of the machine deployment controller. And yeah, just the regular stuff. And as I said, so you have a bunch of options how to step. I think if you just use individual steps, then you essentially pause your whole controller and it won't really do anything until you're done. But if you click here and then use continue, and that should be the button. Yeah, resume program. Okay, they renamed the button. Then in between, when it jumps from here to here, then as far as I know, other Go routines can make some progress. Yeah, and essentially from here, it's just regular debug stuff. You can take a look at variables, add breakpoints, jump back and forth, etc., etc.
Stephen, one question. So, like you have put debugger on line 114, like breakpoint, sorry, the breakpoint, right? So this reconcile function, it could be executed concurrently, right, by different workers.
Yep.
So like when you put a breakpoint, like how do you know like which routine, which worker you are debugging for?
I don't care. I think that's the right answer. So the breakpoint will stop all of those workers because, of course, I mean it's based on a line of code. From a control runtime perspective, it abstracts away from me the worker concept. So what is relevant for me is actually on which object is it reconciling. So the important thing I would say is, hey, what machine deployment are we currently debugging? And what I can do here is just take a look at the request.
Yeah. So like maybe like so the question is, let's say we added the breakpoint and we are expecting something to happen there, but maybe it was done by some other a different worker, right? It is also possible.
Yep. Yeah. So what can happen and what is really confusing is, let's say you're in that breakpoint and you want just to continue from here to here, and then you're hitting that breakpoint again.
Right.
It could happen because actually, concurrently there's another worker and you don't really know in which go routine you are. And if you just step over here line by line, then you can be sure that you're still in the same go routine. But once you click resume, you could jump to something else.
Yeah.
And that can make it complicated and confusing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just need to get used to this. So thanks.
Yeah, I think so for me, it was mostly a matter of using it all over and figuring out what features are there. So just 1 or 2 hints. So I don't know about VS Code, sorry. But with IntelliJ, you can do stuff like, maybe I don't want to break, just break on that place. Maybe I want to break if that's only, I don't know, copy quick start minus empty0. And then it will actually only break if that variable has that content, and otherwise it will just don't do anything. So those are things you can do. What you can also do is something like, please don't break it all, just log something, and then you get an additional log line. And what is really great about that, you can essentially inject additional logs on the fly, and you can also do it in third-party code. So I can go into, I don't know, controller runtime somewhere, which is somewhere in my Go mod cache, and it's kind of not trivial to modify, except if a replace statement in your Go module file. And I can also add a breakpoint here and add a log statement here if I want to, without redeploying anything, recompiling anything, etc. Yep. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that you can do there, but needs some practice, I think. Okay, any questions about that part? Okay, good. Let's continue here. Yeah, of course, you can do the same to webhooks and stuff. I think webhooks are probably, are even easier if you want to understand what's going on there, because you just set a breakpoint and you're validating webhook. Then you do something with kubectl and you immediately see what's happening on the server side. It's not like that controller which is running all the time. You can trigger it more, at a more precisely, let's say that, at a specific point in time, and you don't have to deal with the concurrency here. Not that Not usually if you use validating or defaulting. Yeah. Another thing, just an example, if you want to learn about, so you can do all kinds of things. I'm just making examples for some specific things that you can do. If you want to know how conversion works, let's see if I have still some command here in my history. So let's say I want to, currently my default version is v1 beta 1 because that's the current thing. And now I try to retrieve, let's do that, a cluster based as a v1 alpha 3 version. So then I can trigger that here. And nice. That's not, oh yeah. Let's do control plane because otherwise I have to figure out which one. Let's do, so it's the wrong API group. But the API group should be somewhere here. Let's see, what was that? Cluster. So it should be, I mean, we already have clusters, so it's probably just that. Yep, okay. So that's just a request to get those version. And now you can step through all that conversion code and see how that actually works. And see stuff like, hey, you're adding an annotation here. And when you look at the result, you see minus OYAML. You can see all that conversion magic here, and by stepping through the code, you can figure out how that actually works, or if it doesn't work, why it doesn't work. So I used that a few times in the past. It's also interesting to see how often conversion is called, because it can be quite a lot. Yeah, okay, so far so good. The last thing I have on my list is showing how you can bind it with end-to-end tests. So essentially how you can not only debug when you just deploy clusters manually and play around with it, but also how you can use a tilt management cluster and our end-to-end tests and just, okay, sorry, I have to provide more context. So usually our end-to-end tests, when you start them, they are just bootstrapping a new management cluster and running the tests against that management cluster. But you can essentially, instead of just creating that cluster on the fly, you can use your existing tilt managed cluster. And then you can do things, do two things. On one side, you can step through your end-to-end test. And on the other side, you can step through the controllers to see what they're doing. So if you have some weird issue in your end-to-end test, you can just run your end-to-end test locally against your tilt cluster, a tilt cluster, and then you can step through both things through your controllers and through your end-to-end test and figure out how your controllers react to which steps in your end-to-end test and see where it's going wrong. And the nice thing is, if you just pause your end-to-end test, you have all the time in the world to figure out what the problem is, why the controller is not reconciling something without any kind of timeouts or so. So for me, it's a lot easier than just running some make end-to-end test target and just seeing it fail. And then, I don't know, it's just pretty annoying to figure out things that way. So for me, that's mostly around if I know that an end-to-end test is broken in some way, to figure out details on how it is broken. But let me show you how that works. So first of all, I'll just, I already dropped the breakpoint. That's good. So that was the configuration to connect against the running CAPI controller. And now I show the configuration how to run an end-to-end test against that cluster. One disclaimer, I think it currently only works in core cluster API because we added an additional flag to our end-to-end test to make that possible. It should be, in my opinion, it should be very easy to implement the same flag in other providers. But as far as I know, nobody did yet, and probably nobody knows that we have that flag. But yeah, I'll just show how it works in core CAPI. And if you are interested, just, I don't know, ping me later, open issues. I can help you get that added to other providers if it's not already there. But I'm pretty sure it's not already there. I added that a few months back. Okay, so first of all, just some information. We have a bunch of documentation around testing too. So if you want to see how you can, I think either testing or developing end-to-end tests. Yeah, no, that's the one. If you just want to know in general how to run end-to-end tests via IDE, please take a look at that page. The only difference from here to here is that I'm using an additional flag. And let's see. yeah, it's even documented here. So, but feel free to ping me somewhere if it doesn't work or so. Okay, so what am I doing? So I have a test config here. Yeah, I'm using a test end-to-end as work directory. I set that environment variable. So that's the folder where the log files and other stuff are stored by the end-to-end test. And then I pass in a bunch of arguments. So first of all, you have that end-to-end configuration file, which in our case is docker.yaml. Then I'm focusing on a specific test because I don't want to run, yeah, I don't know, 10 tests concurrently when I debug stuff. I think that's to improve the doc output of Ginkgo itself. I think it also enables live streaming. I think in some modes, Ginkgo just dumps the logs at the end. And I think that also enables that streaming feature so that you see the Ginkgo output as it is logged and not at the end of the test. And that's the interesting flag, and that's just use existing cluster. And that will just use the current context of your local kubeconfig instead of creating a new cluster. And then it accesses that cluster and it checks if the controls are already there, and it should error out if they are not deployed. But in our case, we deployed everything with tilt, so we're fine. So let's see, I'll start with quick start, but I will add a breakpoint at the beginning if I find the file. Yep, so that's the actual test spec, of course. There's a bunch of stuff before, but I want to skip all that. Okay, kind of slow. There it is. Okay, so when we take a closer look at that stuff, we see it will create a local repository that is essentially, yeah, let's say provider configuration, to not go into too much details. Then it was, it still prints initializing the bootstrap cluster, but it actually just skipped that step because it's already there. Then it is checking which providers or controllers are there, and it is start to tail the logs because that's what our end-to-end test is also doing. And then we're actually in the test spec. So, and as I mentioned before, we now have two debuggers running, one in that one controller and one here. And what you can do here is essentially, I think that's what I would probably do. So I know that the test fails at a certain point. I mean, here we just have that quick start thing, so there's not a lot of logic. But let's say we're just going to here. So that's actually the part. I hope. Okay, what did I do wrong? Okay, yep. One mistake. Our controllers are currently written in a way that you can only have, that you should only deploy one infrastructure provider, because otherwise the test doesn't know which provider it should use. So with cluster-cuddle, that should be the generate cluster, config cluster. With the cluster-cuddle config cluster command, it has a logic that it automatically detects your infrastructure provider. But it only works if you only have one. If you have two, then you have to set which one is the one that you actually want to use to generate your cluster YAML. So, and because in our end-to-end tests, we're not setting that. So I think that's just printed like that. Actually, it's just empty. Yeah, because that's how they are currently written. We have to make sure that until we only have one infra provider, if you want to use the test like that, or we have to fix that stuff. So what I just did is I undeployed the provider here, the AWS one. So I only have Docker. Let's see if it's actually updated. So it could be, never actually tried to undeploy it, but let's see what it's doing. Okay, so it seems to regenerate stuff. Yeah.
Stephen, what was that long SSS string in the log? Like, I got curious.
Where was it?
In that log where you see failure, right? Test failed. No, in the editor.
Ah, yep, got it in intention. Sorry, got confused. Which one?
In the Golang editor. If you go, I can't see that. in
so
your
not the
IntelliJ.
debug output, so, or
Yeah, it was in the debug output. If you scroll up more
that
to the beginning.
Oh, I don't know. That's some Ginkgo thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I thought this is like I saw it sometime and I was thinking,
what I
couldn't find it.
Maybe it's something when absolute guess, but maybe it's something like when Ginkgo waits for something, then it prints one S, and then you see how long it takes depending on how many there are. But hey, absolutely no idea. So we would have to place a breakpoint somewhere in Ginkgo. We could, but
actually I was running some E2 and I saw somebody was.
I think that is Ginkgo reporting a skipped test.
Okay.
So one S per skip test. Yeah, that could be. I mean, it's really weird.
Thank you, Fabrice.
Yeah, nice one. Let's just assume that's the answer. Okay, so so it took a while for Tilt just to regenerate all that stuff, but eventually it undeployed Kappa, and now we see here, if I just list all providers, that Kappa is now gone. So now I can actually rerun the test when I find my IDE. Yeah, I was actually hitting that yesterday when I just walked through all that stuff, but yeah, just did it wrong here again. One nice side effect is that if you want to or have to run a test repeatedly, it should be faster because it doesn't have to create a kind cluster, and creating a kind cluster usually takes like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 minutes or something. The only thing that you have to wait for is actually that so the most or the slowest part is generating that local repository here. But apart from that, you're instantly in your test. And there's a flag to work around that, but let's ignore that for now. Okay, so now we're in our test. Let's see. I hopefully have still the other breakpoint somewhere here. Yep, should be. Okay, so that's actually, here we generate our template. We can take a look at all that stuff if we want. And that's actually, let's just call it kubectl apply. So after that breakpoint, we have all our resources in the cluster, and our controllers are actually creating that cluster. And now we're here at wait. So one interesting thing, let's just assume you have an issue somewhere in your template, and that here would actually fail. So your cluster doesn't come up, or your machine deployments doesn't come up, or all that stuff. What you can do is you can just add a breakpoint when something is triggered, and you can wait before you run into that code, which would actually time out your test. So now instead of, oh, what is the timeout? 5 minutes? I have 5 minutes time to debug that. You can just take all the time you want to figure out what's going on, and then just continue your test. So that's sometimes very, very useful, especially if you have a test which takes like half an hour, and you don't really want to run it from the start all the time. You can just go through it slowly, or I would say jump to that point where you know that something is broken, and then just analyze the situation. So in that case, we should have, I would say, another cluster now, because I already had one before. Yeah, and I think probably the rest is pretty much obvious. So just the same as before. If all your controllers running, you can add breakpoints, debug for stuff, look what's take a look at what's happening. You can even play around with the resource you just deployed to simulate some stuff. And yeah, probably I'll leave it at that. Any questions? I think otherwise I would be at the end essentially. So if you have any questions about anything, now is the time. Okay.
Stefan, maybe you already did it, I joined it later, but can you show where all of this is documented in the book, so if people can have a references and eventually go back and ask for improvement to this documentation? Yeah,
absolutely. So yeah, we have, I would say, 2 main documentations which are relevant for what I showed today. So the actual main thing is our developer Tilt page. That's something under rapid iterative deployment with Tilt. One additional hint, please take a look at the main page. So we know when you go to introduction, you see that we have different pages of our book, and just the current state of main is obviously on main. If you just go to cluster API here, then you will have the version of the 1.1 release. So, and the tilt page was slightly improved. But yeah, so that's the page which just documents tilt, the prerequisites, how to actually start a cluster, minimal tilt settings, and all the other fields that I showed, plus the provider-specific stuff. And yeah, I think that should cover that part. And including, let me check, yeah, including how to debug. So that's the configuration for VS Code. Here's a link to the IntelliJ documentation on the page of JetBrains. JetBrains documentation for that stuff. And the other stuff is essentially around testing, how you can then use your tilt managed cluster to run an end-to-end test against that. So that's our testing page, which is here on the developer guide. And the relevant part is below end-to-end tests, running end-to-end tests locally. And yeah, here are examples for test configuration. And I would say, yeah, if you're interested, just play around with it. Please read the documentation first, but please also let us know if there is something missing or if it's not explained good enough, stuff like that. Okay.
Okay. And Stefan, in the tilt file, I also see tracing. Do we have something related to tracing as well, or?
Let's say I have some, or we have some explorations in progress. I would say some very preliminary work, but nothing on main. If you are interested, there is a tracing POC PR here, where you could actually deploy some stuff around tracing, but that's in a very, very, very early phase. So,
okay.
Yeah, but we already have Grafana, Loki, Prometheus. So have you shown how to enable this?
Yep.
Okay.
I went over the entire file and showed essentially all the properties. Yep. So that, I think that's probably what prompted the question here, that I had some tracing stuff commented out.
Yes. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, good. So far, so good. Thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, as I said, if there's any feedback or ideas for future topics. So we have a few more ideas. I mean, we will hold the same session for US, and we will do another one around all the test configuration stuff in Pro. But then we are, let's say, we would have a bunch of options, but what we really want to know is what people are interested in, what would actually help. We could do all kinds of things, but we want to do something which is actually useful. So please comment on discussion if you have something that you would like to learn about also. Okay, but that's really it. So thanks everyone.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.